Hello and welcome. Today we're jumping right into a part of human anatomy that is absolutely central to life, but somehow is still so misunderstood. We're going to clear away the confusion, replace the whispers with some solid facts, and really explore the science, the function, and even the cultural weight of the vagina. Let's get into it. Okay, right off the bat, let's tackle the single biggest mix-up. And the source material is really clear on this. A lot of us, maybe most of us, use the word vagina when we're actually talking about the vulva, all the external parts. And this isn't just about being picky with words. It can lead to real confusion, even in medical settings. So our journey today starts with getting the vocabulary right. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to move through 5 key areas. First up, what's in a name? Let's nail down that vocabulary. Then we'll dive into the biological blueprint, explore it as a dynamic ecosystem, and even get into the science of attraction. And finally, we'll zoom out to look at vagina, culture, and power. So let's jump right in. Section 1, what's in a name? Because honestly, using the right words is the absolute first step to really understanding anything. And here it is, laid out plain and simple. On the left, you've got the vagina. That's the internal muscular canal. On the right, the vulva. That's everything on the outside. The labia, the clitoris, the whole deal. One is inside, one is outside. It sounds simple, but it's a really crucial difference to get straight. All right, now that we have our terms straight, let's move on. We're going to head inside, so to speak, to explore the biological blueprint. We're talking about the vagina's incredible structure and what it's actually built to do. So here's the basic anatomy lesson. You can think of it as a flexible, muscular tube that's kind of collapsed on itself. It sits right between the urethra in the front and the rectum in the back. And at the very top, it connects to the cervix, which is basically the gateway to the uterus. Okay, so what's its job? Well, our sources boil it down to 3 main functions. First, it makes sexual intercourse possible. Second, it's literally the birth canal, which is incredible when you think about it. And third, it's the channel for menstrual flow to leave the body. It's a perfect example of structure meeting function. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The walls of the vagina aren't smooth. They're covered in these folds called rugae. The best way to picture it is like the bellows of an accordion. These folds are what give the vagina its amazing ability to stretch and expand, both during arousal and, of course, during childbirth. Speaking of arousal, it's this really cool physiological cascade. First, blood rushes into the tissues. That's called vasocongestion. This creates pressure, which actually causes a lubricating fluid, a plasma seepage called transudate, to pass through the vaginal walls. At the very same time, the upper part of the canal gets longer and wider, creating what's called a tenting effect. And all this talk about arousal and anatomy naturally brings up a very famous and very debated topic. So what about the G-spot? Right, so what does the science actually say? Well, the truth is, the existence of the G-spot as its own separate thing is pretty hotly debated. There isn't a scientific consensus. The most widely accepted idea right now is that this highly sensitive area isn't a spot at all, but is actually part of the internal structure of the clitoris, which is way, way bigger than it looks on the outside. This completely changes the conversation, right? It suggests pleasure isn't about hitting one magic button, but about a whole interconnected network. Okay, let's keep moving. Because the vagina isn't just a physical structure. It's a living, changing environment. And that brings us to our third section, a dynamic ecosystem. So what's with this number? Well, that's the pH range of a healthy vagina during a person's reproductive years. To give you some context, that's acidic. Think a tomato or maybe a glass of red wine. And this acidity is no accident. It's the body's built-in defense system, creating an environment where it's really tough for bad bacteria to survive. And how does it stay so acidic? Thanks to what's called the vaginal microbiota. It's basically a bustling community of good bacteria, with the superstar players being from the lactobacillus family. These little guys eat a sugar called glycogen found in the vaginal walls, and what they produce as waste is lactic acid. And it's that lactic acid that keeps the pH low and the whole ecosystem in balance. And what's amazing is that this ecosystem is constantly changing, all thanks to our hormones. It's a real journey. At birth, it's acidic from the mother's estrogen. Then, before puberty hits, it shifts to a more neutral or alkaline state. During the reproductive years, it goes back to being acidic. And then after menopause, when estrogen levels drop, it becomes alkaline once again. It's a truly dynamic system. So, we've explored the internal world of the vagina. But how has our biology shaped the way we see each other on the outside? This leads us into a fascinating and sometimes controversial topic, the evolutionary psychology behind the science of attraction. For years, scientists studying this stuff have focused on a couple of key measurements. You've probably heard of them. There's the waist-to-hip ratio, or WHR, which is basically a measure of body shape. And then there's the body mass index, or BMI, which is a broader measure of body fat relative to height. Now, here's the interesting twist. For a long time, pop culture and even some science really pushed the idea that the waist-to-hip ratio was everything. But a major study from the Royal Society turned that idea on its head. It found that BMI is actually the primary factor our brains seem to tune into. That's a huge deal because it suggests our evolutionary instincts might be geared more towards a signal of overall health and energy rather than just shape alone. So why do we even care about these things? Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, things like BMI and WHR are what you'd call honest signals. They're quick visual clues that, over millennia, would have given our ancestors information about a potential mate's health, their hormonal status, and their ability to have children. These were the critical data points for mate selection back in the day. But, of course, the vagina is so much more than just a collection of biological facts. And that brings us to our final section, where we widen the lens to look at vagina, culture, and power, and the journey from taboo all the way to empowerment. I mean, just look at the wildly different ways it's been viewed throughout history. In Hinduism, you have the yoni, which is this revered, powerful symbol of life itself. And then you have the complete opposite. Folklore from all over the world featuring the vagina dentata, the toothed vagina, which probably reflects a deep-seated fear. And there's even a whole literary tradition of the vagina loquens, or talking vagina. It's been seen as sacred, terrifying, and everything in between. In our own time, though, there was a huge cultural shift. You can point to the 1996 play, The Vagina Monologues. It took this incredibly private, often taboo subject and just put it right out there on a public stage. It reframed the conversation and helped make it a topic of identity, strength, and empowerment. It really did help change everything. And that really brings us to our final thought for today. We've gone from the very basics of anatomy through microbiology and all the way to these huge cultural symbols. And it kind of makes you wonder, in a world that's still filled with so much stigma and bad information, maybe the most powerful, most radical thing we can do is just understand our own bodies. Maybe that's the real first step to empowerment.